David Adams didn't believe in fairy tales. He believed in numbers. In profit margins. In the relentless, unyielding logic of the stock market. At 28, he was the youngest billionaire on the continent, a self-made titan whose empire, Adams Holdings, was built on a foundation of ruthless ambition and cold, hard facts. He owned half of the gleaming skyscrapers that pierced the Lagosian sky, and the other half feared him. But behind the perfectly tailored suits and the stoic, unreadable expression, David was a man haunted by silence. His sprawling penthouse, a masterpiece of modern minimalist design, was a monument to his solitude. No family photos adorned the marble walls. No laughter echoed through the cavernous living room. There was only the low hum of the smart home system and the distant, ceaseless roar of Lagos traffic. For years, his mother, Mrs. Adams, a woman whose social calendar was as packed as her prayer schedule, had tried to fix his broken life. "David, darling, there are so many beautiful, well-bred girls at the prayer club," she'd coo over the phone, her voice dripping with desperation. "Just meet one. For me? Your father would have wanted this." His father. The man who had built a legacy but lost his soul to a bitter divorce. A man who had taught David that love was a liability, and marriage was a contract waiting to be breached. David had absorbed that lesson like a sponge. He had seen the way his father had been torn apart, the years of court battles, the public spectacle of a family broken by what was supposed to be a sacred bond. David vowed he would never allow himself to be a pawn in such a game. He wanted a child. A legacy that was purely his own. A heir to inherit the empire he had built from nothing. He had tried every avenue. He dated women, but the moment they started hinting at commitment, he'd shut them down with surgical precision. He had even considered adoption, but the bureaucracy was a nightmare, and he wanted a child with his own blood, a small piece of him to carry on his name. His legacy. Welcome back to African Love Chronicles, your favorite place for stories soaked in passion and soul-deep romance. If you're new here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment to tell us your favorite part of the story. Your support keeps these love tales flowing strong. Thanks for always supporting us. Now, grab your popcorn and let's dive in. The desire for a child wasn't a whim, it was a carefully calculated strategy to fill a void that wealth could not touch. He craved the unconditional connection he had never known. The love he saw in other families, a love he believed was impossible for him to achieve through marriage. A child, he reasoned, would be a new beginning, a relationship built on biology and not on a fickle emotional contract. It was a way to have a family without the risk of heartbreak. A way to ensure his name lived on, untainted by the betrayal he had witnessed in his youth. It was his ultimate act of control, a way to have the one thing he couldn't buy without the messiness he so desperately feared. "This is madness, sir," his best friend and head of legal, Mark, said, running a hand through his hair. "A surrogate? It's just not done like this in Nigeria. The legal risks alone are astronomical. And to find someone who fits your unusual requirements? I don't care about the risks, Mark," David said, his voice flat. "Find me someone. A full medical history. No strings attached. A contract that protects both of us." And, he leaned forward, his eyes fixed on his friend, "She must be a virgin. I need a clean slate. No emotional baggage, no drama. A purely transactional arrangement." Mark stared at him, dumbfounded. He had seen David make impossible things happen, but this was a new level of audacity. A purely transactional surrogate with no emotional baggage, who was also a virgin. It was like asking for a unicorn that could file tax returns. Meanwhile, in a bustling, two-bedroom apartment in Ajij, Sarah Brown was counting Naira notes with trembling hands. Her mother, Mama Brown, lay in the adjoining room, her cough a dry, rattling protest against her failing lungs. The hospital bills were a monstrous, ever-growing dragon, and Sarah, at 22, was the only one left to slay it. Her father had passed away 2 years ago, leaving them with nothing but a mountain of debt. Sarah had to drop out of university. She worked 2 jobs, a waitress at a local canteen and a cleaner at a corporate office, but it was never enough. The money she earned felt like a handful of sand, slipping through her fingers faster than she could grasp it. Her older brother, Michael, had promised to send money from his job in Dubai, but the calls had stopped months ago. She was alone. Every night, she would pray, her voice a silent whisper in the darkness, for a miracle. For a way out. Sarah, my child, her mother rasped, her voice thin as a thread. Have you eaten? You are so thin. Don't worry about me, Mama, Sarah said, forcing a smile. I'm fine. The doctor said the new medication will help you. But the medication was locked behind a payment gate she couldn't break down. The last of her savings was gone. Despair was a heavy, suffocating blanket. One afternoon, she was cleaning the desk of a senior manager at Adams Holdings when a printed document fell to the floor. She picked it up to place it back on the desk. Her eyes, quick and sharp from years of desperation, caught a few words: surrogacy agreement, confidential, and a number so large it made her dizzy. It was an advertisement from the company, discreetly looking for candidates. The words blurred into a surreal, life-altering message. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A way out. A chance to save my mother. The idea was terrifying. She had always been a devout, quiet girl. Her father had raised her to be a proper lady, to protect her dignity, and to be a wife one day. But a wife to who? Her life was on a downward spiral. This was the only way she could see a way to save her mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for her. She folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket, her hands shaking. This was a moral tightrope walk. Her faith, her family's values, her own deeply ingrained sense of right and wrong, all screamed at her. But her mother's life, that rattling cough, that was a louder scream. She went home and, with a few discreet inquiries online, she found the number of the agency mentioned in the document. She called from a payphone, her voice a barely audible tremor. The meeting was set in a sterile, clinical office. David sat across from her, a figure of intimidating perfection. His suit was dark, his posture rigid. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a handshake. He just looked at her, his eyes, dark and penetrating, analyzing her like a spreadsheet. Miss Brown, he said, his voice deep and smooth, without a single note of warmth. My associate tells me you meet all the requirements. Sarah nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was wearing her best dress, a simple Ankara print, but she felt like a ragged doll in a palace. I have read the contract, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. I understand the terms. The full payment is for my family's medical bills, and there will be no emotional entanglement. You will have a child, and I will be able to take care of my mother. David's lips twitched almost imperceptibly. Correct. And you understand the clause about the medical process? It's a highly personal and invasive procedure. There will be no traditional coupling. Sarah's face flushed. The word virgin hadn't been on the paper, but it was understood. It was a bizarre requirement, a sign of his peculiar paranoia. He wanted a vessel, nothing more. And she, a desperate girl, was willing to be that vessel. I understand, she whispered. She had read the terms, the cold words about no contact a distant, necessary evil for the money that would save her mother. At the time, the idea of a child was abstract, a line item in a business agreement. He leaned back, his gaze unyielding. Good. The contract is ironclad. Any attempts to contact me, to the child, or to involve yourself in our lives after the delivery will result in legal action. This is a one-time arrangement. Are we clear? Yes, Mr. Adams, she said, her voice so small it was almost lost in the room. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. The contract was signed. The first installment of the money was transferred to a special account for her mother's treatment. And just like that, Sarah had sold her future for a chance to save her past. The first few weeks were a blur of medical appointments, sterile white rooms, and the uncomfortable coldness of David's detached presence. He was there, a silent sentinel, observing the process with the analytical eye of a scientist. He didn't ask her how she felt. He didn't offer a kind word. He was simply a presence, a wealthy ghost who haunted her medical journey. One afternoon, in a waiting room, Sarah was fiddling with her phone, trying to distract herself from the nausea that was becoming a constant companion. A notification popped up, a news article with a headline that screamed Adams Holdings CEO weds daughter of governor. Sarah's breath hitched. She clicked on the link. The article, however, was a year old and described a political marriage that David had called off at the last minute, causing a major scandal. The photos showed a beautiful, sophisticated woman with a look of pure fury on her face, and David standing beside her, his expression a familiar mask of indifference. The article went into detail about the broken engagement, the millions lost, the public humiliation, and ended with a quote from an unnamed source: "He will never trust a woman again." A piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just about a child. This was about a man who was so broken by a past betrayal that he had walled off his heart completely. "What are you looking at?" David's voice cut through her thoughts. She startled, her phone nearly slipping from her grasp. "Nothing, sir. Just a news article." He didn't need to look at her phone to know what she had seen. He snatched it from her hand and threw it on the empty chair beside him. "You are not a journalist, Miss Brown," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And you have no business looking into my private life. We have a contract. Don't forget that." Sarah felt a sting of humiliation and a sudden rush of anger. "I wasn't. It just came up. And I don't care about your private life, sir. All I care about is my mother." "You think you're the only one with problems?" The words were out before she could stop them. David froze. His mask of indifference cracked for the first time. For a moment, a flash of something akin to surprise, or was it pain, crossed his face. He stared at her, not with coldness, but with a flicker of raw, wounded humanity. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. A nurse called her name, and the moment was gone. But something had shifted. The wall between them, so carefully constructed, had a tiny, hairline fracture. Sarah knew she had crossed a line. She braced herself for an angry confrontation. But when she emerged from the doctor's office, David was gone. His driver was waiting to take her home, a crisp note for a taxi clutched in his hand. David was paying for her to get to the hospital and back to her place in a high-end car, a gesture that was both generous and profoundly impersonal. The next morning, a different driver arrived. It was David's personal driver, a cheerful, talkative man named Kike. He handed her a large, beautifully wrapped gift box. Inside, she found a brand new smartphone. "Olga said you need this for medical appointments," Kike said, grinning. "Don't worry, he's not tracking you. He just wants to make sure you have a reliable way to get in touch. He's a good man, you know. Just a little rough around the edges." Sarah stared at the phone. It was more than a gift. It wasn't an apology. A silent, unspoken acknowledgement of her humanity. And in that moment, she realized that behind the billionaire's fortress of indifference, there was a man who was just as broken, and maybe, just maybe, as lonely as she was. She clutched the phone tightly, a tiny, foolish hope blooming in her chest. A hope that this cold, transactional arrangement might be more than just a deal. But a month later, her hope was shattered. A week after her first trimester scan, David's lawyer called and told her that they needed to meet. Her heart pounded, and she could feel the cold dread. Was she getting terminated? Was the money being taken back? As she sat down in the conference room with David, the air was tense. "Miss Brown," the lawyer started, his voice a low monotone, "we've received the first trimester scan results, and while everything is going smoothly, there is a complication. The results indicate that you're not carrying one child but two. You're pregnant with twins." The words hung in the air, a bombshell that rocked her to her core. David's face, which had been impassive a moment ago, now held a hint of, was it fear? And the lawyer's next sentence sealed the deal. "This changes everything. Mr. Adams' agreement was for one child. He is terminating the contract, and you are being paid for the duration of your pregnancy, but you are not to keep the children." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She looked at David, her eyes wide with panic. His face was unreadable. Was this really happening? After everything she had given up for this? The lawyer's words, terminating the contract, felt like a punch to the gut. Sarah's world, which had just started to find a shaky footing, began to crumble. She looked at David, searching his face for any sign of mercy, but found none. He sat perfectly still, a marble statue of a man, his gaze fixed on some point just beyond her shoulder. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You can't do this. I have a contract." The lawyer, a man with a face as colorless as his suit, cleared his throat. "Miss Brown, the contract is explicit. It covers the birth of one biological heir. The presence of a second child constitutes a material breach of the original terms. Mr. Adams has the right to." "I don't care about your terms," Sarah cried, her carefully constructed composure snapping. "This is a life. 2 lives. You can't just throw them away because they weren't in your plan. The clause about no contact was an abstract line on a page she had signed out of desperation. But now, after feeling the first kicks and seeing the 2 tiny heartbeats on the screen, those words were no longer abstract. They were a knife to her heart. She wasn't fighting a contract anymore, she was fighting for her children. David finally looked at her. His eyes were cold, but there was a flicker of something raw and desperate hidden in their depths. You will be compensated for the entire period, as per the agreement, he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. You can use that money to start your life over. You're free. Free? Sarah laughed, a short, bitter sound. Do you think this is about money anymore? I'm carrying your children. They are not just things you can dispose of when you feel like it. The word children seemed to hit him. His jaw tightened, and he stood up, walking to the window. The Lego skyline, so beautiful and imposing, seemed to mock her from beyond the glass. You don't understand, he said, his voice strained. You don't know what it's like. My mother, she was supposed to have a son and a daughter. They were twins. The girl was stillborn. The complications from the birth, they nearly killed my mother. She spent years in and out of the hospital. I watched her suffer. I watched my father crumble under the pressure. Twins, they are a bad omen. They bring nothing but pain and tragedy. Sarah stared at his back, a silence filled with his unspoken torment. The icy wall he had built was not just about a broken engagement, it was a fortress against a deep, primal fear. He wasn't a monster, he was a man terrified of history repeating itself. So you're just going to get rid of them? She asked, her voice cracking. Because you're afraid? He turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and anguish. I'm not getting rid of them, he said, the words a low growl. I'm protecting myself. And them. There is a way to do this. A different contract. The lawyer handed her a new document. Sarah's eyes scanned the page, and her heart stopped. The terms were staggering. A trust fund for her mother's complete medical care, a fully furnished apartment for her and her family, a generous monthly stipend for the rest of her life, all for one, simple, impossible condition. She was to continue the pregnancy, but when the babies were born, they would be taken to a private home, away from her. The contract stated she would never be allowed to have contact with them. Her role would be over. The money was for her to live a comfortable life, in a new city, far away from her past. David was paying her to disappear. Tears welled in her eyes. It was a golden cage. He was offering her the world, but it was a world without her children. It was a deal she knew she could never take. I won't do it, she whispered, her voice fierce. I can't. These are my babies. You can't just buy them from me. David walked over, his face now a mask of cold determination. He leaned in close, his voice a low, commanding tone. Listen to me, Miss Brown. My father's ex-wife took everything from him. She tried to take my family name, his business, everything. I will not let that happen to me. This is the last offer. Take the money, save your mother, and start over. Or walk away and face the world with 2 children and no means to care for them. The choice is yours. But know this, if you walk away, you will regret it. I can make your life very, very difficult. A chill ran down her spine. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with his power. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a threat. He was giving her everything she had ever wanted, but at a price too high to pay. She looked at the contract in her hands, then at the man before her, a man who saw her only as a problem to be solved. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. The fear was gone, replaced by a steely resolve she never knew she had. She wouldn't be a victim. She wouldn't be bought. She was a mother now. The conference room door slammed shut behind her, the sound a final, deafening echo of David's cold finality. The threat still hung in the air, a poisonous cloud. I can make your life very, very difficult. Sarah didn't doubt it. She walked out of the gleaming skyscraper and onto the busy Lego street, the noise and heat a stark contrast to the sterile, air-conditioned room she had just left. She clutched her purse, feeling the thin line of her last few naira notes, a terrifying reminder of how little she had. She had made her choice. She had refused the golden cage and chosen the uncertain, dangerous path. Now, she had to face the consequences. Her first stop was her cleaning job at Adams Holdings. Her boss, a kindly, older woman named Mrs. Johnson, looked at her with pity as she handed her a severance check. "I'm so sorry, dear," she said, her voice a hushed whisper. "Mr. Adams himself sent the order. Said you resigned." The word felt like a lie. David hadn't given her a choice, he had simply started to make good on his promise. Sarah's hand shook as she took the check. It was a pittance, barely enough to cover a month's rent, and she knew the next call would be from the hospital, demanding payment for her mother's care. That evening, the phone rang. It was the hospital's billing department. "The funds from your initial deposit have been depleted, Miss Brown. We cannot proceed with your mother's treatment until the account is fully funded." Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She called David's lawyer, Mark, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, just let me talk to him. My mother, she's dying." There was a long silence on the other end. "I'm sorry, Miss Brown," he said, his tone sympathetic but firm. "Mr. Adams has instructed me not to take your calls. The contract is terminated. The rest is out of my hands." But Mark was lying. He had just come from a meeting with David, a tense, difficult conversation that had left him with a sour taste in his mouth. "You can't just cut her off like this, David," Mark had pleaded. "Her mother is sick. This is cruel, even for you." "Cruel?" David had sneered, turning away. "It's a business transaction, Mark. She chose her path. She knew the terms. She chose her family, now she can deal with the consequences." But even as he said the words, a small, nagging voice in his head told him he was wrong. He had watched Sarah in the conference room, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective love. It was a look he had never seen before. A love that wasn't selfish, or demanding, or contingent on money. It was pure. And it terrified him. He had convinced himself that love was a liability, but seeing her fight for her babies, for her mother, for a future she couldn't even see, stirred something in his cold, empty heart. A feeling he had long buried. Meanwhile, Sarah, exhausted and defeated, sat by her mother's bedside, holding her frail hand. Mama Brown, a woman who had weathered so many storms, smiled weakly. "It is God's will, my child," she whispered, her voice raspy. "He will provide." Sarah couldn't believe it. Her faith was wavering. She had prayed for a miracle, and the miracle had come with a price tag she couldn't afford. She had one last resort. The phone David had given her. It had his direct number, something his driver had slipped her without his boss' knowledge. Sarah looked at the phone, then at her mother, then at the twins in her womb, a trio of helpless lives depending on her. She had to try. She dialed the number, her thumbs shaking. David picked up on the third ring. "What is it?" he asked, his voice sharp with annoyance. "Please, David," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Just let them have the medication. It's not about me anymore. It's about my mother. Please." Silence. David could hear the desperation in her voice, the raw, unvarnished fear. It was not a plea for money, but a plea for a life. The silence stretched, and for the first time, Sarah heard something new in his voice, not the cold, unyielding billionaire, but something else. A flicker of doubt. David stood in the middle of his penthouse, the phone still pressed to his ear long after Sarah had hung up. Her voice, broken by fear and despair, echoed in his mind. "It's about my mother." The words were a sharp, unexpected blow. He had expected her to fight for herself, for the money, or for the children, but she was fighting for someone else. It was an act of selfless love, a concept so foreign to him that it made his meticulously ordered world tilt on its axis. He didn't want to admit it, but her plea had pierced the armor he had built around his heart. He took a deep breath and threw his phone onto his desk. "Mark," he yelled, his voice a low growl. Within seconds, Mark was in the room, his face a mixture of concern and resignation. He had never seen David this rattled. "Wire the hospital," David commanded, his back to his friend. "Fund the full treatment plan for Sarah Brown's mother. Do it anonymously. Don't let her know it's from me." Mark stared, speechless for a moment. "David." I thought you said. I said what I said, Mark, David snapped, turning to face him. This isn't about her. It's about me. I won't have the death of an old woman on my conscience. It's a business expense. Nothing more. But his eyes betrayed him. Mark saw the conflict, the quiet desperation of a man trying to rationalize an act of kindness. He nodded and left without another word, a small, hopeful smile playing on his lips. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She had come to say goodbye. But when she spoke to the billing clerk, the woman's expression was one of confusion. Miss Brown, a large donation came in this morning. A full, anonymous payment for your mother's treatment and care. It's all taken care of. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. An anonymous payment? A miracle. She wept with relief, the tears streaming down her face as she hurried to her mother's room, a new hope blossoming in her chest. She had prayed, and a miracle had come. She didn't know who had done it, but she knew it wasn't David. It couldn't be. He had made it clear he was cutting her off. Meanwhile, across town, David was seated at his desk, a computer screen showing a live feed from a small camera his security team had installed outside Sarah's building. He watched her return from the hospital, her face shining with a joy he had never seen before. He watched her embrace her mother, tears of relief streaming down her face. He saw the way she carefully put her mother to bed, how she sat by her side, a silent, loving guardian. A flash of regret, sharp and bitter, shot through him. He had everything she didn't, and yet she possessed a richness he could never buy. The weeks that followed were a fragile, unspoken truce. Sarah's mother's health began to improve. Sarah found another, less paying job, and though she was still struggling, she felt a quiet strength she hadn't had before. She was no longer just fighting for a sum of money, she was fighting for her children and for the life she wanted to build for them, with or without David. David, however, was becoming increasingly obsessed. The anonymous financial aid he had given her was a small crack in his fortress of indifference. He now watched her from a distance, observing her life like a morbidly curious scientist observing a specimen. He saw her struggles, her small moments of joy, the way she would gently rub her growing belly while on the bus, a silent, loving gesture. He found himself drawn to the raw, human connection that was so absent from his own life. This voyeuristic fascination was interrupted by a knock on his office door. His mother, Mrs. Adams, walked in without waiting for an answer. She carried herself with the poise of a queen, but her face was tight with a barely contained fury. David, she said, her voice a low, dangerous purr. I just got a call from a member of my prayer group. She's the mother of one of the doctors at the hospital. She told me you have a surrogate. A young girl from a poor family. And that she's pregnant with twins. David's blood ran cold. He had been so careful. But his mother's social network was a web of gossip and information he could never escape. He didn't respond, a silent, tense standoff. Don't lie to me, she said, her voice rising. I know it's true. David, I raised you to be a good man, not a man who uses a desperate girl to get what he wants. And twins? David, you know what happened. You cannot, you will not, bring this bad luck into our family again. David finally looked at her, his eyes cold and unyielding. This is not what you think, mother. This is a transaction. I'm building a legacy, not a family. You're making a mistake, David, she said, a deep sadness in her eyes. A terrible mistake. She turned and left, but her words hung in the air, a final, unshakable condemnation. David was alone again, but the silence in the room was no longer just his own. It was filled with the accusing echo of his mother's voice, the raw despair of Sarah's plea, and the two tiny heartbeats he had seen on a screen, a constant, nagging reminder that some things in life couldn't be controlled by money. The silence in the penthouse was no longer a comfort, it was a punishment. David stared at the cityscape outside, at the sprawling metropolis he had conquered, and felt nothing but a hollow emptiness. His mother's words, his father's ghost, and the image of Sarah's tear-streaked face at the hospital all merged into a cacophony of regret. He had convinced himself that he was protecting his legacy, but now he realized he had only succeeded in creating more pain. The simple, clean transaction he had envisioned had become a tangled, emotional mess. He needed to fix it. He needed to see her. Not to negotiate, not to threaten, but to understand. He got into his car, leaving his driver behind. He didn't want his world following him to hers. He drove through the familiar, affluent streets of Akoi and Victoria Island before the landscape began to change, the glittering glass towers giving way to a different kind of life. The streets of Ajit were a vibrant, pulsing organism, filled with the aroma of street food, the loud rhythm of market traders, and the easy laughter of people who had very little but seemed to have so much more than he did. He pulled up to a modest apartment building and stared at the address he had memorized from the security footage. A feeling of dread, mixed with a strange, nervous anticipation, settled in his stomach. He was a billionaire who had conquered the world, but standing on this street, he felt like a stranger on a foreign planet. Upstairs, Sarah was helping her mother eat dinner, a simple meal of jollof rice and fried plantain. Her mother's health was slowly improving, a silent testament to the generosity of a stranger. Sarah still prayed for him every night, this anonymous benefactor who had saved her mother's life. She hadn't forgotten David, though. She felt the twins' kick, a powerful, comforting reminder of her resolve. She was at peace. She was no longer a victim, she was a fighter. A knock on the door startled them both. A strange-looking man was standing in the doorway, a look of profound unease on his face. It took a moment for Sarah's mind to register that the man standing before her in a crisp, dark suit was David. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice a mix of fear and indignation. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice flat, but his eyes were searching, looking beyond her into the humble apartment. He was seeing the truth of her life for the first time, the worn furniture, the small, loving gestures, the quiet dignity of a woman living on the edge. He had watched her life on a screen, but seeing it in person was a different kind of reality. "I need you to take the money," he said, his voice low and pleading, a stark contrast to his usual commanding tone. "Please. I want to pay for everything. I'll get you a house, a car. I'll ensure your children never lack anything." Sarah stared at him, her eyes welling with tears. "You don't understand, do you? You can't just buy my children. They're not for sale. You can't just throw money at a problem and expect it to go away. I'm keeping my babies. They are my future." His face hardened. "You can't afford them, Sarah. You'll struggle. They'll have nothing." "They'll have me," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "And that is everything." A loud, piercing cough came from the bedroom. David's head snapped towards the sound. Sarah's mother lay on the bed, her face pale, her breathing labored. David felt a pang of guilt so sharp it took his breath away. He had almost let this woman die because of his own pride and fear. I'll take her to a better hospital," he said, the words spilling out of him, a desperate, clumsy attempt to fix what he had broken. "She's fine," Sarah said, a cold edge to her voice. "Thanks to someone with a heart, not a bank account. Now please, leave." Just then, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. A well-dressed woman stepped out, her face a mask of determination. It was David's mother, Mrs. Adams. She had followed him. She walked up to the door and stared at David, then at Sarah, and a look of dawning horror, mixed with something else, sympathy, crossed her face. "David," she said, her voice an icy whisper. "What have you done? What have you done?" The words hung in the air like a curse. Mrs. Adams stood in the doorway, her elegant frame rigid, her sharp eyes cutting across the dimly lit room. Her pearls gleamed against her throat, but there was nothing soft or maternal in her expression. Disappointment rolled off her like a storm front. Sarah froze where she stood, one protective hand on her belly. David, towering beside her, stiffened, his jaw locked tight. For a man who feared no one in boardrooms or backrooms, he suddenly looked like a boy caught stealing bread from his mother's kitchen. "Mother," David began, but she raised one gloved hand, silencing him. "You used a girl, a child barely out of school, as a surrogate? Without family, without protection, without even the decency of choice?" Her voice trembled with rage, each word cutting deeper. She turned on David, her eyes blazing. "Do you have no shame? You've reduced a human being to a contract. And for what? So you can parade an heir before the world while hiding the filth behind your empire's polished glass?" Sarah's heart stuttered. Her mind raced with the fragments of what she had just heard, words heavy with accusation, with shame. She looked between mother and son, and for the briefest flicker, she saw something raw in David's eyes, not fury, but unease. David straightened, slipping back into the armor of indifference. "This isn't your concern, mother. It's business." I needed an heir. Mrs. Adams stepped forward, ignoring her son, and looked directly at Sarah. Her gaze softened only slightly when it fell upon the girl's pale, exhausted face. Child, is your mother still ill? Sarah swallowed, unsure if this was a trap. Yes, ma'am. But, she's improving. Someone paid for her treatment. Mrs. Adams tilted her head, a sharp glint in her eye. And you think it was a miracle? Sarah hesitated. The question sliced too close to the truth. She clutched the edge of her wrapper tighter, trying to steady her voice. I don't know. I've been praying. Mrs. Adams's eyes flicked to her son. Tell her, David. Tell her whose money saved her mother's life. The silence was brutal. David's shoulders stiffened, his lips pressed into a hard line. He didn't move. He didn't speak. Finally, Mrs. Adams sighed, the sound both weary and damning. She turned back to Sarah. It was him. My son. The same man who threatened you, who threw you to the wolves. He saved your mother, though he will die before admitting why. Sarah's breath hitched. She stared at David, anger and confusion warring in her chest. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes betrayed him. She saw the truth there, buried beneath the layers of coldness he wore like armor. Why, she whispered, her voice shaking. Why would you? David cut her off, his tone sharp and dismissive. Don't mistake charity for affection. It was a practical choice. I didn't want her death on my record. But the words rang hollow. Even Sarah could hear the lie trembling in them. Mrs. Adams exhaled, heavy and disappointed, before speaking again. Enough of this. Pack your things, girl. Your mother will be moved to St. Catherine's, the best hospital in Lagos. And you, she looked at David, her gaze like a blade, will not abandon the woman carrying your children. If you won't do what's right, I will. Sarah's world tilted. You want me to come with you? Mrs. Adams nodded once, her decision final. You and your mother. You'll be under my roof until those children are born. And perhaps, David, in the presence of what you've ruined, you'll learn the meaning of responsibility. David's lips parted as if to protest, but he saw the fire in his mother's eyes and said nothing. He turned away, pacing to the window, his fists clenched at his sides. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears. The thought of living under the same roof as David, the cold man who threatened her, who saved her, who confused her every breath, made her stomach twist with dread. And yet, a small ember of something else, something dangerous and reckless, sparked deep inside her. She looked at Mrs. Adams again, who extended a hand as though sealing a pact. Come, child. You and your babies will be safe now. Whatever happens, you'll have my protection. Sarah's hand trembled as she placed it in the older woman's. Behind her, David finally turned, his eyes locking onto hers, a storm raging in their depths. For the first time, she felt the full force of what it meant to be bound to this man, not by choice, not by love, but by something far more dangerous. And so, with her mother's frail cough echoing down the narrow apartment hall, Sarah Brown stepped into a new chapter of her life, one filled with luxury, secrets, and a man who both repelled and pulled her in with terrifying force. The convoy arrived at the Adams estate just after dusk. A sweep of headlights washed over the wrought iron gates, which swung open silently at the command of men in crisp black uniforms. Sarah sat in the back seat of the Mercedes, her mother beside her, dozing from exhaustion. Across from them, Mrs. Adams sat upright, hands folded neatly in her lap, her silence heavier than any reprimand. Sarah pressed her palm against her belly, feeling the faint flutter of her children. The road wound upward, and then suddenly, the mansion loomed before her, a palatial structure of glass and white stone that glittered under the Lagos night like a fortress of light. Inside, the air was cool and perfumed with lilies. A sweeping staircase curved like a question mark into the upper floors. Crystal chandeliers hung like constellations overhead. But beneath the beauty, Sarah felt only alienation. She didn't belong here. Her slippers squeaked against the marble as she followed the butler carrying her mother to the guest wing. Your mother will have her own suite, Mrs. Adams said briskly, gesturing toward the East Hall. Nurses will be stationed here at all times. St. Catherine's staff will oversee her recovery. You'll be close enough to visit but far enough to rest. Sarah nodded mutely. Gratitude warred with unease. Nothing in this world came free. And though Mrs. Adams had offered her protection, Sarah couldn't shake the sense that every step deeper into this mansion was another knot in a web she didn't understand. When they reached the suite prepared for her, she stopped short. The room was enormous, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens, a four-poster bed with silk sheets, a wardrobe filled already with dresses that weren't hers. "I can't stay here," Sarah whispered, shaking her head. This is too much." Mrs. Adams regarded her steadily. "You will stay here. You're carrying my grandchildren. They will know comfort before they take their first breath." The words fell heavy. Grandchildren. Sarah hadn't thought of it that way. To her, they were her babies, her hope. To Mrs. Adams, they were heirs, bloodline. Before she could reply, a voice echoed from the doorway. "She doesn't want your charity, Mother." David. He leaned against the doorframe, his tie loosened, his face shadowed with fatigue. But his eyes, sharp, restless, fixed on Sarah as though she had trespassed in his sanctuary. Sarah's spine stiffened. Every nerve screamed for her to run, yet she held his gaze. "I didn't ask for this," she said quietly. "No," David said, pushing off the doorframe, stepping closer, his voice a dangerous whisper. "You asked for nothing. And somehow you've been given everything." The words stung. Shame, fury, and confusion churned inside her. She wanted to scream at him, to thank him, to hate him, all at once. But before she could speak, Mrs. Adams's voice sliced through the tension. "Enough. Both of you." David turned away, jaw tight, hands shoved in his pockets. He looked like a man fighting a war only he could see. Mrs. Adams smoothed the front of her dress, her expression unreadable. "Dinner is at 8. Sarah, you'll join us. David, you'll behave like the man I raised, not the beast you've become." And with that, she swept out, leaving the air charged and suffocating. Sarah sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. David stood in the shadows, silent, watching her as though she were both his ruin and his salvation. His lips parted, as if he might say something, but then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall like a warning. The dining hall of the Adams estate was not a room, it was a statement. A long mahogany table stretched almost endlessly, flanked by velvet chairs and crowned by a chandelier so vast it seemed ready to collapse under its own brilliance. Candles flickered in silver holders, their flames reflecting off crystal glassware. The space whispered of wealth, power, and old traditions. Sarah felt dwarfed as she stepped inside. She smoothed the plain dress she had chosen from the wardrobe, her nerves trembling as sharply as the glass in her hand. She had never sat at a table like this, never felt the weight of so much silence pressing down before the first course was even served. Mrs. Adams was already seated at the head of the table, regal in her posture, a woman carved from dignity itself. To her right sat David. He leaned back in his chair, one arm draped lazily along the armrest, his expression unreadable. His tie was gone, the top buttons of his shirt undone, as though the formality of dinner meant nothing to him. Sarah took the seat across from him, her pulse thundering. A maid slid the chair beneath her and poured her water. "Eat," Mrs. Adams commanded gently, as servants began to set down steaming dishes, pepper soup, roasted chicken, pounded yam. The scents rose into the air, rich and comforting, yet Sarah's throat felt too tight to swallow. The first few minutes passed in silence, the clink of silverware echoing in the cavernous room. Sarah focused on her food, but she could feel David's gaze like heat against her skin. Every time she lifted her eyes, she found his fixed on her, steady, assessing, as though she were another acquisition he was considering buying. Finally, Mrs. Adams broke the quiet. "Sarah," she said, her tone measured, "I trust you're comfortable in your room?" Sarah set her spoon down carefully. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you. It's more than I could ever imagine." "Good," Mrs. Adams replied. "You'll need rest. Carrying twins is no small feat." Her eyes shifted briefly to David. "And you'll need support." David's fork paused midair. "She doesn't need me," he said coolly. "She made that clear." Sarah's breath caught. Her eyes snapped up, meeting his. "I never said that," she whispered, voice trembling with anger and something else, something dangerously close to longing. "I only said I don't want your money to buy what isn't for sale." The table fell into heavy silence. Mrs. Adams's eyes flicked between them, sharp with awareness. David leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Sarah's. His voice dropped, low and edged. Everything has a price, Sarah. You'll learn that here. Her heart hammered. She should have looked away, but she didn't. She held his stare, her chin lifting in defiance. Not everything, she said softly, almost a vow. The air between them thickened, charged, a storm gathering across polished wood and silver cutlery. For a heartbeat, it felt as if the rest of the room had vanished, leaving only the two of them suspended in that dangerous gravity. Then Mrs. Adams cleared her throat. The sound was quiet but cut through the tension like a blade. That's enough, she said firmly, her regal voice broking no argument. Sarah, you will eat. David, you will remember that responsibility is not a choice when lives are at stake. And both of you, her gaze burned, sweeping across them, will not turn this house into a battlefield. Sarah lowered her eyes, cheeks flushed. She forced herself to take another spoonful of soup, though it tasted of ash in her mouth. Across from her, David reclined back once more, but his eyes remained on her, dark and restless, as if she had ignited something in him he could not name. When dinner ended, Mrs. Adams rose gracefully. Sarah, tomorrow morning, I'll have one of the house staff show you the gardens. Fresh air will be good for you. She paused, her gaze narrowing on her son. David, I suggest you join us. You both have much to learn. Sarah's pulse quickened at the thought. The gardens. More time near him. More danger. She wasn't sure whether she dreaded it or secretly longed for it. David only nodded once, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. As you wish, mother. And as Sarah rose from the table, she felt his gaze follow her once more, a tether invisible but unbreakable, pulling her deeper into a world she couldn't escape. Morning sunlight poured across the Adams estate, turning the sprawling gardens into a canvas of green and gold. The air smelled of jasmine and damp earth, the kind of cultivated beauty Sarah had only ever seen in magazines. Roses climbed trellises, fountains whispered softly, and manicured hedges lined cobbled paths that seemed to stretch endlessly. Sarah walked slowly, her hand grazing her belly, the other lifting her wrapper against the dew. A maid trailed a respectful distance behind, carrying a parasol, but Sarah felt like an imposter in this place, a poor girl cloaked in borrowed silk, surrounded by wealth that wasn't hers and never would be. Walk faster, or the sun will catch you, came a voice from behind. Her pulse leapt. She turned to see David striding toward her, hands tucked into his pockets, the morning light catching in his dark hair. He wore no suit today, only a white shirt rolled at the sleeves, yet he carried himself with the same command as in the boardroom. Your mother asked me to walk with you, Sarah said quietly, forcing herself to face forward again. David gave a humorless chuckle. Of course she did. My mother loves to meddle. He slowed his stride to match hers, his presence overwhelming even in silence. For a few minutes, they walked without speaking. Birds sang from the trees, and the sound of trickling water followed them down the path. But the quiet between them was anything but peaceful, it was charged, like the air before a storm. Finally, Sarah broke it. Why do you keep looking at me like that? She asked, her voice sharper than she intended. David turned his head, his gaze sweeping her profile. Like what? Like I'm some puzzle you're trying to solve. He stopped walking. Sarah's heart stumbled as he stepped closer, invading the air around her. His eyes, dark, piercing, locked onto hers. Maybe you are. Her breath caught. She wanted to step back, but her feet refused. You think everything can be solved, she whispered, almost trembling. Everything bought, everything calculated. But I'm not one of your business deals, David. I'm not for sale. A muscle ticked in his jaw. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied her, as though memorizing every line of her defiance. Then, almost reluctantly, he stepped back. No, he said finally, his voice low. You're not. They walked on, the silence heavier now, but different. Sarah could feel his restraint, the tension in his movements, as though he were fighting something he didn't want to admit. At the rose garden, she paused, drawn to a bloom the color of blood. She bent slightly to inhale its scent, her hand unconsciously resting on her belly. David stood a few paces behind, watching. The image seared into him, her soft curves framed by sunlight, her strength and fragility entwined. Something twisted in his chest, sharp and unfamiliar. He hated it. He wanted to look away, but couldn't. Why twins? He asked suddenly, his voice startling her. Sarah blinked. What? Why did it have to be twins? His tone was harsh, almost bitter, but his eyes betrayed something else, a flicker of fear, of memory. Sarah straightened slowly. I don't know. That's not something I chose. It's not something anyone chooses. He said nothing, only turned his face away, jaw clenched as though fighting ghosts she couldn't see. The silence stretched until Sarah finally whispered, You're afraid of them, aren't you? David's head snapped back, his gaze scorching hers. Careful, he warned, his voice a dangerous growl. But there was no real menace in it, only desperation. Before she could press further, Mrs. Adams's voice drifted from the terrace. Children, she called, regal and commanding. Breakfast is ready. David exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, breaking whatever spell had gripped them. Without another word, he turned and strode back toward the house. Sarah lingered a moment, her heart pounding, her fingers brushing the rose's velvet petals. The breakfast room was smaller than the cavernous dining hall but no less intimidating. Sunlight spilled through tall windows draped in silk, pooling across a long table laden with silver trays. The scent of fresh bread, akara, and brewed coffee mingled in the air. Sarah entered hesitantly, her palms damp. She wore one of the dresses Mrs. Adams had insisted she try, soft cream cotton with a high waistline that hugged her swelling belly. It felt strange on her body, as though she were playing dress-up in someone else's life. Mrs. Adams was already seated at the head of the table, her teacup poised delicately between manicured fingers. Beside her sat David, sleeves rolled up, reading the morning papers. He didn't look up when Sarah approached, but she felt his awareness like a physical touch. Come, child, Mrs. Adams said, gesturing toward the chair opposite David. Eat. You must keep your strength. Sarah obeyed, lowering herself carefully into the seat. A maid moved swiftly to serve her, toast, fruit, a glass of milk. Sarah murmured thanks, keeping her eyes down. The silence stretched, broken only by the rustle of David's newspaper. Finally, Mrs. Adams spoke. I had the staff prepare the nursery yesterday. Sarah's head shot up. Nursery? Mrs. Adams nodded. Of course. For the twins. It's only proper they have a place ready for them. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her belly. That wasn't necessary. Nonsense, Mrs. Adams replied smoothly. These children are Adam's blood. They deserve the best. David folded the newspaper slowly, setting it aside. His gaze locked onto Sarah, steady, unflinching. You don't approve? Her pulse stumbled. They're my babies, she said softly. I don't want them growing up thinking they belong to someone else. A dangerous silence followed. Mrs. Adams's brows lifted, but she said nothing, watching the two like a hawk. David leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table, his voice low. You think I want to take them from you? Don't you? Sarah whispered, her throat tight. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, something raw, unguarded. Then it was gone, replaced by cool indifference. No, he said, his tone like steel. I want them raised with security. With power. Not this. His gaze flicked, almost cruelly, toward the simplicity of her old life, the things she had fought so hard to hold. Sarah's fingers curled against the tablecloth. Love is more than enough. His eyes burned into hers, a storm raging just beneath the surface. The tension snapped taut between them, so thick she could barely breathe. And then it happened. She reached for her glass of milk at the same moment he reached to slide the fruit bowl toward her. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact, but electric. Heat shot up her arm, and from the way his hand stilled, she knew he felt it too. She snatched her hand back as though burned, her breath catching. His jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening against the glass. Neither spoke, but the silence screamed louder than any words. Mrs. Adams set her teacup down with a deliberate clink. It seems, she said softly, that my son and his guest are discovering how complicated family can be. Color rushed to Sarah's cheeks. David pushed back his chair abruptly, rising to his feet. I have business. His voice was clipped, too sharp. Without another glance, he strode out, leaving only the echo of his footsteps. Sarah sat trembling, her heart galloping. Her hand still tingled where it had brushed his. She hated herself for it, hated the way her body betrayed her, the way she longed for something she shouldn't. Mrs. Adams's gaze lingered on her, sharp and knowing. Then she spoke, voice low, almost conspiratorial. Be careful, child. My son builds walls for a reason. And those who climb them often find themselves trapped inside. Sarah lowered her gaze, but inside, a storm churned. She didn't want his world. She didn't want his walls. And yet, the memory of his touch lingered, dangerous and intoxicating.